عن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: أمرت أن أقاتل الناس حتى يشهدوا أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمدا رسول الله ويقيموا الصلاة ويؤتوا الزكاة فإذا فعلوا ذلك عصموا مني دماءهم وأموالهم إلا بحق الإسلام وحسابهم على الله تعالى. رواه Bukhari ومسلم. So it was narrated on Ibn Umar, Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu anhu, that Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if this decides not to freeze. On Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu anhu, the Prophet ﷺ said, I have been ordered to fight against people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and until they perform the prayers and pay zakat. And if they do so, they will have a gained protection from me for their lives and their property, unless they do acts that are punishable in accordance with Islam, and their reckoning will be with Allah the Almighty. Narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. So, first to start off this hadith is that it's covering a topic that isn't very familiar with us today, but we hear a lot about it in the media and the news, and that is fighting in Islam. And so just to backdrop this is that this is a concept that a lot of times can cause doubt for a lot of people. And so to address the issue of doubt is that when there is a doubt, not just in this particular issue, but in any issue, it's a very serious issue in Islam. It's more serious than falling into sin, not because it's sinful in itself, but because when you're in a state of sin, there's always that door, obviously, of repentance, and you're still a Muslim. Whereas when there's doubt inside, that could grow if you don't address it right away, and it could grow, and it can manifest, and it can multiply until it can push you out of Islam. And so make sure that if there is any doubts, that you ask people about them, you're open about it, don't hide it, don't try to subdue it. Make sure you address it head on, because there's answers to these doubts, and these doubts, you're not the first person to have these ideas. And so gaining knowledge is usually the best antidote to these things, and making dua to Allah, being sincere about this process. So just wanted to put that out there. I'm not saying ask me questions, but ask people who speak to you, people who you find have answers that are meaningful and valuable for you. Make sure you seek those kind of people's advice. So that's kind of the backdrop. So this brings up the issue of qital, more largely jihad. So I think before getting into the hadith itself, and just also to backdrop, if people need to leave, feel free to do so, just because I'm going to try to do some explaining on this controversial topic throughout this hadith. It might take a little bit longer, so I know it's late, feel free to leave whenever you need to. But basically, just to give a little backdrop onto our modern understanding of jihad, one important lesson to understand is something that Sheikh Abdul Nasir Jangda always drilled into our heads, was that one extreme breeds the other. Right? And this is a very important topic to understand and contextualize. It's a very complicated topic, nuanced topic to talk about how we got to the point we are today, but very, very simply, if you look back in history, and the problem with looking back in history is you can keep going back and back and back to explain something, but if you were to just explain modern history, let's go back to the point of colonialism. Colonialism, you got one extreme that was bred in that time, because you had a time where people were invading lands, and the colonial powers, one of the biggest resistance they faced when they were conquering these lands was this concept of jihad, because you enter the land, and then the people there were like, okay, you're entering our lands, you're destroying our homes, taking our homes, destroying our families, we will resist, and their resistance is sanctified by God. And so they have this fervor that won't die, it can't be pacified, they can't be dominated. And so people at the time kept resisting, and that was like in India and Africa, in the lands of like the Middle East, what Europeans call the Middle East. In those lands, those are the hardest people to subjugate, the people who had this concept of jihad drilled into them. So two things were done. One was the concept of divide and conquer, turning this energy towards each other rather than towards the people who are invading. And the other thing that was done was, after the colonial powers took over, was to make sure that this concept was erased or subdued. And so like generations of people were raised not understanding what just jihad meant, not understanding the context for jihad, making it seem like it wasn't a part of Islam, or making it seem like it was an evil part of Islam. So you had generations of people who are on one end of the extreme, where it doesn't exist, or it's evil and it's like old school. And so then a few generations later, you get this other extreme now, where you have a post-colonial world, where people are trying to look back towards like their glorified history and try to see like how do we get back to those days, and now they find this concept of jihad and it's not contextualized and they don't understand it and teachings haven't been passed down, and so then you'll have another extreme of people who say jihad's for everyone and everything. And a lot of times people turn to this hadith to try to justify that in other places. So we'll try to address that issue. To first say that this is not to be apologetic. This is to say that there is such a thing as just fighting in Islam, but it has to be just, and there's very specific circumstances for that, and it's a whole conversation. Anyway, getting into the hadith. The first question is, so what is the context of this hadith? So if you're saying that things should be contextualized, what is the context for this? So this happened during the Battle of Khaybar, is when this hadith was said. And so Khaybar was a fortified city. This is right after the Battle of the Trench, Battle of the Ahzab. Ahzab means confederates. And so there's confederations of Arab tribes, basically every major Arab tribe that was not already aligned with the Muslims or had some peace treaty with them. They got together and they formed an alliance and they besieged Medina for 30 days. So for a whole month they besieged Medina, and they nearly wiped out the entire Muslim state. And they trespassed peace treaties, they trespassed like their ethics, even their own moral codes. And so this is happening right after this. And so after that happens, the people from Khaybar were some of the people responsible for organizing this confederation. So right after the Ahzab, some people, Muhammad ordered them to go besiege the city of Khaybar to prevent future battles like that. And so they besieged it for a long time, they weren't able to gain entries. And so he said that tomorrow he's going to give the flag to somebody who will carry it and give them victory. And this is someone that who loves Allah and His Prophet. So every companion wanted it in that moment. And Umar said that this was the only time in his life where he actually desired leadership, was in that moment, because he wanted to be the person who loved the Prophet and Allah. And so he puffed up his chest and he's hoping that Muhammad would make eye contact with him and call him out. But he called Ali, radiallahu anhu. And so Ali came and he said, "For what should I fight?" So you're calling me to fight. What should I fight for? What am I fighting for? And so the answer was this hadith. And it explains for what the fighting has been called for. So we're going to go through it, just the beginning part, word by word. First thing is umirtu, right? So the Prophet says, "I have been commanded." It's "I have been commanded." And so, first of all, you see this and you say, this isn't in the Quran. If the Prophet has been commanded, why don't we see this command in the Quran? And so this is, there's a lot of proofs for this, but this is bringing up the concept of there's two kinds of wahy. Wahy is revelation, and there's two kinds of wahy that the Prophet receives. There's wahy jali, which is like the clear or obvious wahy, which is the Quran, right? It's the expounded revelation. And then there's wahy khafi, which is like the hidden wahy, which is how Allah would reveal things to the Prophet conversations. And this is where we get a hadith Qudsi, a hadith that Muhammad speaks on behalf of God, but it's not Quran. This is, Prophet going to Isra Ma'raj and meeting God and talking to God. This is a lot of things. And so one of them is wahy khafi. Here he's saying he's been commanded. And so this is not command from the Quran, but command from God directly. The next word is umirtu an uqatil. So it's very interesting, very important to note here. Qital is on, in the Arabic language, there's different ways you can conjugate a word. So this scale, this conjugation of the word, is in the form of mufa'ala, which means that two people are engaged in an act. So it's not, so for example, another version of this is tanasur, right, is another example. Tanasur means two people helping one another out. It's two people engaging in an act with one another. Tawasul, right, tawasul bil-haqqi, means to advise one another. So it doesn't mean you give advice, it means make sure you are advising one another. And here, qital is, and uqatil would be two people who are facing each other. So it's not you chasing somebody down and trying to kill them. It is when two people are on a battlefield fighting one another, there's two people opposed. So it's a very important point linguistically. Another thing is that jihad does not mean qital. A lot of people translate jihad as fighting. Jihad is not fighting. Jihad is to struggle. And we've heard this maybe many, many times. It's very important to note that jihad is this huge category of things. It's struggling. It is, avoiding temptations. It is when you're out in the streets and you're I'm not gonna eat that thing that's really tempting, but it's haram. Or I'm not gonna look at that person inappropriately. Or it's when you trying to spread knowledge, or it's trying to unite people. trying to give in charity, that's all jihad. Waking up at night to go to fajr, that's all jihad. Like anything that's a struggle for you in this like sake of good is a jihad in Islam. A very small subset of this is qital, fighting, in which you fight for a just cause. And so the next word is an-nas. And this is what really troubles people, is that an-nas seems very general. An-nas means like the people. An example is قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ, right? Say in the name, I seek refuge in the Lord of the people. And here it mentions every single person. Like Allah is the Lord of every single person. So does this hadith tell us that Prophet ﷺ was commanded to fight every single person? That makes no sense, because of every contradictory piece of evidence in Quran and hadith. We'll get into some of them later on. But la ikraha fi din, right? So there's no compulsion in religion. There's so many years before and after this incident, the Prophet ﷺ did not go and fight anybody. And so there's a lot of obviously evidence against it. So what does it mean by nas? Why does it seem so general here? And so we'll go into an example is in Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, with قِيلَ لَهُمْ آمِنُوا كَمَا آمِنَ النَّاسِ. Here it says, and if it is said to them, believe as the people have believed. Again, it uses that word an-nas, the people. But it doesn't mean all people, so it doesn't mean go believe like every person on earth has believed. Because not every person on earth has believed in Islam. Like it doesn't mean go believe in that, go believe in this. It means very specifically a group of people, a subset of people. And here it refers to the Sahaba in this ayah. A very other good example is Nasr إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. And if you see the people, again, the nas, entering the religion of Allah in like waves, right, or in throngs. Here it's not saying that every single person on the planet all of a sudden is just going to enter Islam at once. Here it's mentioning either the people of Mecca or the people of Arabia. That's what specifically meant here. And so this hadith is mentioning that exact same group of people. And so the two best interpretations, the two most authentic interpretations of an-nas in this hadith is either the mushrikeen of Mecca or the people of Arabia. So I have been commanded to fight the mushrikeen of Mecca who have fought the Prophet ﷺ for his entirety of his career up until this point. Or the polytheists of Arabia who have just engaged with him in the battle of the trenches, which they besieged them for a month and tried to wipe out the Muslim elite. So like here it's a very specific thing that was mentioned. So it's not to generalize to all people, and a lot of times people take this hadith in like a very vacuum, and they linguistically an-nas could mean like everybody, but they don't look at the context of it and what it's meant or how it's referenced in the Quran. So it's very, very important. You can say, for example, like the students protested. It doesn't mean every student in the universe like protested. It could mean like students at UC Berkeley, students in this class. Like the students were unhappy with the exam. It doesn't mean every student's unhappy with the exam. It means the students that did not do well are unhappy with the exam. So it's like usually you're referring to a subset of people. And so we went over that. So some proofs in the Quran, obviously, almost should not be mentioned, but there's no compulsion in religion. And that concept is brought up many times in the Quran. La ikraha fi din, lakum dinukum waliya din, for example, to you is your religion, to me is my religion. Prophet ﷺ's command in the Quran, it says that your responsibility is only to send the message. You can't guide those whom you love. You are not a guardian over them. It's all these messages again and again to the Prophet that you're not going to make people Muslim if they don't want to be. Your job is just to deliver a message, not to kill people. So it seems again here that then how is this hadith fitting with all of this, with the bulk of Islam? And so we'll get into that. So then what about fighting? What is justified fighting? And then when you say it's justified, obviously part of it could be defensive, and that makes a lot of sense. Someone's invading you, you're fighting back, you're defending. So what about expansion? Because in Islam, there has been periods of expansion in Islam. So how do you justify that? And so they're under the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ. That's the only time where you can look at fighting as being, the fighting under the Sahaba and under the Prophet ﷺ, that was just fighting. Anytime after that, people have been mistakes. There have been good leaders who have done just wars, and there have been bad leaders who have manipulated Islam for their benefit. And so in our history is not perfect. So there's been history where you be like, yeah, that was a terrible example, and they manipulated the religion, and there's other examples of good. But one period of time where you can be like, for sure, this was the way they did it was correct and how we would interpret it, would be under the Sahaba and the Prophet. And in those times, they took over the places that were the Roman empires and the Persian empires, and North Africa. So it's like, how did that happen? Well, first of all, if you look at the context again here, in the Roman and the Persian Empire was defensive because the Romans were the first ones to actually make a move. They had invaded, they were making a move to invade, which is where the Battle of Mu'tah happened. And the Persians were the ones who started persecuting Muslims because Muslims on the periphery of the Persian Empire started converting to Islam, the Arabs around the Persian Empire. And the Persians started persecuting them and demanding like higher taxes and killing them and all these other things. So those two were defensive. And in North Africa, it was also a different case. And you got all the way to Spain. And it's very, very interesting when you also need to understand it's a very different kind of framework, because now we come from a state where, first of all, there's two major changes. One is that there's like this concept of a nation state. The other one is that there's now international treaties, which didn't exist before. The war, there's a really good article at your Plain Institute, which goes into a lot more depth than I'm going to have time for, whether I'm going to even be able to. But basically, there's the idea of like the default of all of human history has always been war unless there's a treaty. If there's two empires that border each other, they will always show dominance and power by trying to fight with one another for border control and land and resources and stuff like that, unless there's a treaty between them. And so in any society, whether you're like Arabia or your Roman Empire, whatever, there was always fighting happening, people encroaching on your borders. So you're always defending your borders. And those borders, as you defend them, will always expand. Until you get to a point where there's international treaties that establish everything. And that only happened in the last 100 years. And so you could not use this concept of expansion today. It would be a totally different framework that you're working under. Because now you have treaties that you have to respect, which is the object of Islam. And even in the Quran it says that if people only fight people who are fighting you, and once they incline towards you to incline towards peace, then you should incline towards peace. And so you should always seek diplomacy, and that's basically like the summary of just war in Islam. But it's obviously there's a lot more nuance in this conversation than we're going to have time for. Another thing is like what's under the scope of war in Islam. So the concept of war is so different in Islam too, because there's no concept of collateral damage. There's zero, like not like a little, not 1%, like there's zero collateral damage allowed in Islamic fighting. You're not allowed to burn trees, you're not allowed to hurt animals, you're not allowed to kill any innocent life at all. Any innocent life or any damage you cause to private property or public property infrastructure is personal liability. So if you're a soldier and you kill an innocent person, you have to go to court and either pay off that like crime, like going to prison or paying blood money, or you're going to be persecuted for it, whether it's like capital punishment, whatever the punishment is. And so you're personally liable for collateral damage. Whereas today, the collateral damage of today's battles has a higher death toll than in the entire battlefields of then. So the way people understood war wasn't this massive slaughter where everyone fights to the death and you kill everyone, like men, women, children, civilians. At the time, it would be like, for example, Uhud, which is like one of the greatest losses of the Muslims at the time. 70 Sahaba died. And today you'd have a bomb explosion, like a truck explosion go off, and like 150 people will die as collateral damage. So it's like a totally different concept of warfare. The Battle of Mu'tah, which was a battle between the Muslims, who fought anywhere between 100,000 to 300,000 Romans. The minimum number that's reported in any source on either side was 100,000. And the max was 300,000. So it's a huge army they're facing that's like unbelievable scale. Only like a few dozen people died, if that, maybe even less. So it's like very different concept of warfare when you're talking about warfare in Islam. And so that's also very, very important to note. So someone's trying to like wag their moral finger at you, like you didn't develop nuclear weapons, you didn't go and colonize and kill millions of people. The concept of warfare in Islam is when it's justified for the concept of spreading peace or to protect yourself and your land, then you do the minimum amount of fighting. So it's a very, very important concept. Another point is that fighting only became allowed in Islam, not prescribed, allowed. It was only allowed in Islam after going to Medina, or like when going to Medina. In Mecca, it was never allowed, despite all the persecution that happened. In Mecca, what was established was Tawheed first, and then conveying the message to others. The Quran was being revealed. Salah was established. Fasting was made mandatory in Medina. And then lastly, Hajj. And like these things developed over time. You get people who have developed the basics, whereas now people are trying to go fight and do all these things, but they haven't developed any of these basics. So Islam's calling towards setting a foundation, not calling you towards fighting. That's not the priority. But you won't win. A lot of people ignore that whole part. And obviously another part of a legitimate battle or warfare is that you need a centralized state. You need a khalifa, someone who's going to be able to arbitrate and find when is a situation just to defend and to fight, and when not. And that's not a situation we find ourselves now. So obviously there's a lot more. The Queen Institute has really, really good stuff on this, and I would recommend that if there's still trouble with it. And the only two groups that really think that this kind of hadith is generally Fox News and ISIS. And so, you're not in a good situation if you're on their boat. And another example is obviously for 1,400 years, Muslims have been the champions of living in an interfaith environment. Christians have lived in Egypt, for example, since the Muslims got there 1,400 years ago. Jews have generally followed the Muslims where they go to avoid persecution everywhere else because it was the only place that they were safe. So generally, the history of Islam, I think, proves itself, with a few exceptions which should be acknowledged. And so then getting into the hadith itself, some of the benefits. So shahada here, the first thing it says that until the people say shahada, which is la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And so the first thing is that shahada is not just belief in Allah, but it's also the messenger, which is very important. It seems very obvious to us, but for everyone else, they might be like, yeah, I believe in God, but I just want to accept the messenger. But that's very, very problematic, because the messenger is what's bringing you the message of what God's telling you, and all the implications, salah, fasting, zakat, salah, all these other things. And even understanding, our understanding of God is conveyed by the messenger. So it's very important that these two parts are complete, because then you get the full package. And the next part is that there's a verbal element to it and also a physical element. So first is the shahada, and then salah and zakat. And then why only two things are mentioned, not like all the fara'id. Some people say it's symbolic, it includes the whole thing. You mentioned the whole thing by part of it. Another thing is that that this is what's kind of visible on the outside. You can't hold someone accountable for going to Hajj or not. You don't know their situation. You don't know if someone's fasting. That's secret. No one knows if you're fasting or not. But salah and zakat are something that's visible, and it's also important for society to function as a whole. So that's why these are the two things that I mentioned. And then it goes on to the haqq of Islam, we won't get into that. Everything else to be taken care of. And then it says وَحِسَابُهُمْ عَلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, and everything else will be essentially taken care of by Allah. So the idea is that this is kind of the exception that proves the rule. You cannot fight or kill anybody because Allah's going to take care of the rest, right? So it's telling you that you only have this very restricted area in which you can justify anything, and then the rest is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And intention, for example, what if someone just uttered the statement of la ilaha illallah, they don't mean it. It doesn't matter. It's all about the intention. The intention is just by Allah, and you just take things at face value and you assume the best. And so the last thing I would say is also that this whole hadith is in first person. Is umirtu and uqatil nas hatta, and it says asmu minni. So it's all the Prophet is talking about himself. I have been commanded so that I fight until they get peace from me. So it's very specific to the Prophet. That was the last point. But hopefully that clarifies some things. And if it doesn't, point you to some resources, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for your time. May Allah accept, inshallah.